Today's daf is daf Samach Zayin, and the Gemara had established that according to Rabbi Yehuda, as opposed to Rabbi Meir, a ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeres, and that's based on the principle called kahal gerim kriye kohol. So when the Torah says lo yovo mamzer b'kal Hashem, that you're not allowed to marry a mamzer, included in that is a ger, as opposed to Reb Shimon, who holds that kahal gerim eno choshev kal. So the Gemara now wants to know the following: Vinisne. Where's Vinisne? You'll count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At the end of the sixth line, do you see the word Vinisne? So the Gemara wants to know if it's true that our Mishnah here in Masechet Kiddushin reflects the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that a ger is enjoined from marrying a mamzeres. Then why isn't it written explicitly in the Mishnah? When the Mishnah creates a klal, a general rule, that if there's marriage, which means there's tfisas kiddusha, the marriage is valid, but there was an avera, meaning it was an illegitimate marriage, then the Mishnah establishes a principle of havlad holechachar pogum. And in that case, what it would mean is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if a ger were to marry mamzeres, then the child would be a mamzer, like his mother. And that should have been included in the Mishnah. And the Gemara answers, Tana kol makom disefo lasuye. The Mishnah added a phrase called makom. And that extra phrase is coming to include the case of a ger who married a mamzeres, that the vlad is misyaches basar imo, like his mother, and he's a mamzer. Iba is saying, but the Gemara says, if you want, I'll give you a different answer. And we can reconcile our Mishnah even with Reb Shimon, who holds that a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres. Li'olam, I'm sorry, I said Reb Shimon, I meant Reb Yossi, sorry. Li'olam Reb Yossi. Rabbi Yossi holds that a ger is allowed to marry mamzeres, and nevertheless, the vlad of such a marriage has the same status as his mother, and he is a mamzer. And that's not against our Mishnah, because even though our Mishnah says that whenever there's a heter nesuin, when the marriage is itself legitimate and permissible, that the vlad goes according to the father. So that would mean that in this case, since a ger is allowed to marry mamzeres, the vlad is miyuchas to the father, which means he's not a mamzer. But that's why the Mishnah adds ezo zu, meaning in what cases, the Mishnah asks, is the vlad miyuchas to the father? That's only if, let's say, a Kohen marries a bas Leviah, or a Levi marries a bas Kohen. In all those cases, even though the mother comes from Kahuna, the father from Leviah, or vice versa, the vlad goes bas to the father. And the word zu, ezo zu, is meant to exclude any other case. Limute, to exclude a case of a ger shenos mamzeres, where the vlad is not miyuchas to the father, like in the case of Kahuna and Leviah, but rather the vlad is miyuchas to the mother, and therefore the vlad is a mamzer. So as it comes out, just to summarize, the Mishnah uses two very important phrases, pivotal phrases. One phrase is kol makom, and the other phrase is ezo zu. The kol makom comes as an inclusion, as a ribui. And that would work out very well according to Rabbi Yehuda, because it's telling you that in the case of a ger shenosa mamzeres, the vlad is misyaches to the mother. And then we have the phrase ezo zu, which is an exclusion, a miut, and that works out very well according to Rav Yossi, who holds that even though the marriage is legitimate, nevertheless, and a ger is allowed to marry mamzeres, nevertheless, the child is miyuchas to his mother and he's a mamzer, as opposed to Kahuna Leviah. So Gemara is not happy with this. The Gemara is going to raise the following objection. Is it really possible to say that when the Mishnah says Yesh Kiddushin V'Ein Avera, it comes to Ezezu to actually exclude other cases where the Vlad is not miyuchas to the Av? Visu lo. And you're telling me that it's only coming to exclude this case of a ger that marries a mamzeres. Well, what about the case Harei Chol Shenasa Bas Yisrael, a Chol who's excluded from Kahuna? He's possible as a Kohen, and he marries a Bas Yisrael. To Yesh Kiddushin V'Ein Avera. There's no Avera over here, and the Kiddushin is certainly valid. And yet, we're going to have a Mishnah later on at Daf Ayin Zayin that Havlad Holech Achar Zachar, which means that the Vlad is a Kohen Chol like his father. Now, this case is not mentioned in our Mishnah. So you see that even cases that are not mentioned in the Mishnah, the din is like that the Vlad is Holech Achar Av. So how can you tell me that Ezezu is limiting it only to the cases of Kohanim and Leviim, if you follow what I mean, when it also applies to the case of a Chol Shenasa Bas Yisrael, that the Vlad is Holech Achar Zachar. So you can't tell me that the Ezezu is an exclusion, because if that be the case, it should be excluding Chol Shenasa Yisrael, Bas Yisrael, and we know that in that case the Vlad is Holech Achar Zachar. Gemara says Holokasha. That's not a valid objection. Why? Because our Mishnah reflects the Shita of Rabbi Dostoi ben Rabbi Yehuda, spherically. And the Shita of Dostoi, Rabbi Dostoi, is that if a Chol marries a Bas Yisrael, the Vlad is kosher l'kahuna. That means the Vlad picks up the yichus of its mother. And therefore, once again, we could allow our interpretation of Ezezu in the Mishnah that's coming to exclude other cases. For example, although Kahuna and Leviah depends upon the yichus of the father, in the case of a Chol that marries a Bas Yisrael, the yichus is determined by the mother, according to Rabbi Dostoi. And let's say a girl is born, she can marry a Kohen, she's not a Chalola, just like her mother is not a Chalola. Gemara is not happy with that either. Why? Varei, I have another case that's not mentioned in the Mishnah. Yisrael shenasa chalola. If Yisrael marries a chalola, Diesh Kiddushin V'Ein Avera, there's no illegitimate marriage over here. You know, Yisrael can marry a chalola. A Kohen can, but Yisrael can. And nevertheless, Havlad Holech Achar Zachar. So this should be another case similar, identical to Kahuna and Leviah, where the yichus is determined by the father. And here too, in the case of Yisrael Shenasa Chalola, the Vlad is Holech Achar Zachar. And this is called a mikvah. No, just one second. No, actually, the phrase mikvah is more appropriate for the previous line in the Gemara of Rav Dostoi. Rav Dostoi says if a Chol marries a Bas Yisrael, she becomes like a mikvah to be mitar chalola, because her children will not be chalola. Here in this case, the Vlad is Holech Achar Zachar, not because the Yisrael is a mikvah. I mean, the Yisrael is not a chalol, so when the Vlad is not a chalol, that's not a mikvah. That's not being mitar the chalolos. Maybe you could say it's a mikvah for the chalola when she marries the Yisrael. In any event, we see clearly, the Gemara asks, that the language Ezezu in our Mishnah is not coming to exclude other similar situations where the Kiddushin is mutter, and the vlad is not miyuchas to the father, because here's a case of a Yisrael shenosel chalola, and the Kiddushin is valid, and the vlad is kosher ke'avid. So we have another case similar to Kohen and Levi, where the yichus goes and is determined by the father. Our answer is Tana kol makom dereisha lasuye. Remember, we had two things in the Mishnah. We had a diuk from Ezezu as a miyut, and then we had a diuk from kol makom as a ribut. So the kol makom is coming to add this case that we mentioned before of Yisrael who marries a chalola, and the vlad is misyaches to the ovid. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, v'nisnei beheja, why is it that the Mishnah hints about this by adding the phrase kol makom? Why did the Mishnah just say it outright explicitly, that a Yisrael who marries a chalola, the vlad is misyaches li'ovid? Just like the Mishnah mentions Kohanim and Leviim and so forth. And the Gemara answers, Mishum Dlo Masni La. It means it's not a simple way of writing it. It would require a lot of ink, meaning, a kind of verbose, complex formulation. Why? Heichi Nisni. How are you going to convey this message? It's going to say Kohanis Leviim Yisrael v'Chalola Sheniseis L'Kohen Levi v'Yisrael. Well, what does that mean? You want to add the case of a chalola that was married to a kosher Yisrael, whether he's a Kohen Levi Yisrael, but that doesn't make any sense in this context. As the Gemara raised the objection, v'chalol l'kohen v'chazia, you're adding it as an addendum to Kohen and Levi in Yisrael. Well, Kohen is not allowed to marry a chalola. So therefore, the Mishnah would have to separate, or shall we say, divide up into two different sections, two segments or bubbles, and you'd have one section that mentions Leviah, Kohenes, Levi Yisrael, and then a whole new section for Yisrael that marries a chalola. So therefore, the Mishnah, instead of going through that whole verbose presentation, the Mishnah just says kol makom as a ribut. Gemara now asks the following: you would just medayik ezuzu as a mute. Frek the Gemara, va'ika de Rabba Baruch Chana. I have another case where the Kiddushin is mutter, it's a legitimate marriage, and the vlad is miyuchas to the father, and it's not mentioned in the Mishnah. And therefore the Ezuzu is going to exclude it, but yet it has the same identical din. And what is that? The Omar Rabba Baruch Chana, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Mitzvus Rishona, Bina Shlishi Avi. Okay, the law is the Torah allows a ger mitzri, only his grandchildren could enter into the Jewish people. And I don't know if he quotes the pasuk here. Dar shlishi avo. Oh, here it is. Dvarim chav gimel. That's Parashas Ki Teitze. Dar shlishi yavo lehem b'kal Hashem. So what's the status of this vlad? The father is a mitzri sheni, meaning he's the son of a mitzri that was a ger. His child should therefore be a mitzri shlishi, who's allowed to come into the kol, but the problem is he married a mitzris rishona. And her children have the status of a mitzri sheni, who's not allowed to marry a Jewish person. And Rabbi Baruch Chana establishes that b'nah shlishi avi, that akol holech achar zachar, and since the father of this child is a mitzri sheni, this child therefore has the status of mitzri shlishi, and he's allowed to come b'kol. So here's a case of a legitimate marriage because a mitzri rishon, a mitzri sheni is allowed to marry a mitzris rishona, and yet the vlad is holech achar ha'av, and he's a mitzri shlishi, which is exactly identical to Kohen and Levi, and yet it says Ezezu, and we said that Ezezu is coming to exclude any other case. The Gemara answers, Tana kol makom dereisha lasuye. Again, we keep vacillating back and forth. We have the miyud of Ezezu, but then we have the ribui of kol makom, and in this case, we're going to say the kol makom is coming to include even the case of a mitzri sheni that married a mitzris rishon. Gemara asks the following kasha. Ula Rav Dimi di Omar Sheni Havi. What about the Shita Rav Dimi? He disagrees with Rav Yochanan. According to Rav Dimi, the Yichus is boss of the mother. The mother will determine the Yichus. She's a Mitzvah Rishona, and therefore the child of her marriage to a Mitzvah Sheni is going to be a Mitzvah Sheni, because she's a Mitzvah Rishona. So therefore, by being Miyuchas to the mother, we have a case where the Kiddushin is Mutarim, and the Vlad is Holech Achara Ima. And the first klal in our Mishnah was that if the Kiddushin are Mutarim, then the Vlad is Miyuchas to the father. So according to Rav Dimi, how do we read our Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, Tana Ezuzu Lemute. Once again, we're going to say that here's a case where despite the fact that the marriage is legitimate, the child of that marriage is going to be Miyuchas to his mother and not to his father. And that's according to Rav Dimi in the case of a Mitzvah Sheni who marries a Mitzvah Rishona. The Gemara now goes back and asks on this original principle in the Mishnah that if the Kiddushin is legitimate, meaning Mutarim, then the Vlad is Mesiachas Ilavim. Va'ika, what about the following case? The Chiasa Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Omer b'Shem Rav Yochanan. Right, there were two great Talmidim of Rav Yochanan, Rav Asi and Ravin. And Ravin says in the name of Rav Yochanan that Ba'umos, what happens if you have two Goyim that get married? And one of them belongs to one nation, the other to another nation. What is the status of the Vlad? Is the Vlad belong to the nation of the father or the nation of the mother? Who cares? We do care. Why? Because let's say you have a guy, let's say, we'll call him a Frenchman, and he goes ahead and he marries a Knanis. Now the Torah says about the Knanim, lo techai kol neshama. We got to go out and battle against them and destroy them. But now, this Vlad has a mother that's a Knanis, but a father that's not a Knanis, that belongs to the other Goyim. So what's the status of this Vlad? And Rabbi Yochanan has established that Holech Achar Zachar, that since the father's a Frenchman and not a Knani, therefore we have no mitzvah to kill the Vlad. However, in Isgairu, what happens if both the father and the mother undergo gerus and now they get married? So he was originally a Frenchman, now he's a Jew. She was originally a Knanis, now she's Jewish. Halach achra pogum shebishneim. Now Rashi explains that this is a case where the father is an Ammoni. An Ammoni is never allowed to marry a Jewish girl. And the mother is a Mitzris. And you remember that we said that the third generation of a Mitzri is allowed to marry a Jewish person. So the Ammoni, all of his descendants are excluded from Kahal Yisrael. Whereas in the case of a Mitzris, her grandchildren would be allowed to enter into the folk if there was Gerus. And now there was Gerus, but the father was an Ammoni, and the mother was a Mitzris. And the halacha is Havlad Holech Achra Pogum Shebishneim. Which means that the Vlad is miyuchas to the father in this case, who's an Ammon. And that would mean that all of the descendants from this marriage are excluded from the call forever and ever, because an Ammoni lo yovel b'kal Hashem, period. So we see that here's another case where the Kiddushin are mutarim, it's a legitimate marriage. He's a ger and she's a gyoris, they can marry each other. And the Vlad is Holech Achra Av, which means the Vlad is now stamped with that exclusion from Kal Yisrael because the father's an Ammoni. So here's another case that should be included under the klal that if the marriage is legitimate, then the child goes after the father. And the Gemara answers, Tana, Ezezu Limaute. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I wish I could erase the last two sentences. Again, the klal of the Mishnah is that if the marriage is legitimate, then the Vlad just 1 second, I'm sorry. So wait a minute. So what's the Gemara's kasha now? 1 second. I'm sorry, I lost the mathematics here. He's an Ammoni, and he became a ger. She's a mitzris, and she became a gioris. And now they get married. I got it. Sorry. The grandchild of this marriage is allowed to marry into Kal Yisrael because his grandmother is a mitzvah, he's a mitzvah shlishi. And even though on the father's side, he's an Ammoni, but nevertheless the Vlad goes after the mother. So the Gemara answers, Tana Ezo Limaute. It means to exclude the case where the Kiddushin is mutarin and the Vlad is not going to be miyuchas to the father, but rather to the mother. So let's just summarize what we learned. In the Masechet, he has a little bit of a paragraph of a summary, a short summary. He says there are 4 dinim that were established by the Mishnah, and the 4 dinim that were not mentioned in the Mishnah. One is a ger shenosam mamzeres, which we said according to Rabbi Yossi is allowed, and yet the child is miyuchas to the mother and is a mamzer. Number 2, we have the case of a chol who marries a bas Yisrael, and therefore the marriage is legitimate. According to the Mishnah, we would have said that the Vlad therefore is miyuchas to the father who's a chol. No, Rab Tolstoy says that the Vlad is kosher like his mother. Now we have a third din. A mitzvah sheni marries a mitzvah rishona. The nesuin is mutter, and according to Rab Bar Chana, the Vlad is miyuchas to his father, and therefore he's a mitzvah shlishi. According to Abdimi, the Vlad is miyuchas to the mother, and he's a mitzvah sheni. And finally, we have the case of a ger Ammoni, who married a gioris mitzvahs, and Rabbi Yochanan says the Vlad is miyuchas to the pogum shabbeinu. Okay. Now, initially, we started our discussion here with Reb Shimon, who's of the opinion that a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres. And nevertheless, despite the fact that the Kiddushin is valid, the child is a mamzer, like his mother. So Gemara asks the following kasha, hi mai. How are you going to explain the Mishnah? I could figure out this Mishnah if we reflect the Shita of Yehuda, who says that a ger is not allowed to marry mamzeres, and therefore the Vlad is miyuchas to the pogum, and therefore the ger that violates the Isra marries a mamzeres, the child is a mamzer like his mother. Is then we could justify this because kol makom dereisha lasuya Yisrael shenasa chalala. The kol makom in the reisha is coming to include the case where the Kiddushin is mutter because a Yisrael is allowed to marry a chalol, only a Kohen is enjoyed from marriage. And the Vlad is miyuchas la'av, and he can marry, and she can marry a Kohen. Or we said that there's a ribui of Rabbi Bar Chana, that if a mitzvah sheni marries a mitzvah rishona, then the Vlad is miyuchas to the father, and he's a mitzvah shlishi. Also, we have Ezezu limute dirav dimi, who says that the Vlad of a mitzvah sheni with a mitzvah shona is miyuchas to his mother, and he's a mitzvah sheni, and he cannot come to call. Even though the Nesuin were ksherim, nevertheless, the Vlad is miyuchas to the pagum and not to the father. And it also comes to exclude the din of Ravin, of a ger amoni who marries a gioris mitzvahs, and the Vlad is miyuchas to the pagum, according to Rabbi Yochanan, as Ravin quotes him, even though the Nesuin are mutar.